Postrel. Welcome to my podcast. My guest is Steve Teles, a political scientist at Johns Hopkins University and the Niskanen Center. This is the second of two conversations with Steve. In this conversation, which was recorded on October 24th, we focus on his analysis of academic sectarianism, aka why conservatives don't get hired at universities, why that is a problem for universities, and what universities should do about it. Let's get started. Hi, Steve. We're back.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Our audience may not realize how long it was between these two
Right, exactly. Well, they will. I'm gonna say in the intro, but so it's been about a month since we talked last, but I wanted to do two interviews with you because we didn't get to one of your important recent essays, Beyond Academic Sectarianism, and I wanted to run interviews back to back. So your article's called Beyond Academic Sectarianism. People probably know what beyond means and they have a decent idea of academic, but what do you mean by sectarianism?
Okay, so I published this piece. I should say a little bit about the background of this piece, which everyone should read and send to their mother and everything. I actually gave a talk that was almost all of the same logic of this thing.
Right.
I think it was 5 years ago. And it just sat on my computer in PowerPoint format. And I'm in retrospect not quite sure why I didn't publish it.
Well, if it was 5 years ago, there was something that happened in between that made life weird.
Well, stuff happened, but I don't think that was it. I think I was like, well, do I really want to get into this? Is this the fight I really want to get into? But I'd been in a bit of a writing slump, and at some point I was like, screw it. I'm just going to start writing again. And I've got this stuff on my computer and I'm just going to take it off of PowerPoint and start writing it. And what I was trying to do, this was a conference with mostly conservatives who were mostly grumpy about academia. And conservatives, I mean, you've been around this world for a long time. There's nothing they love more than complaining about universities and talking about how bad universities are and how universities won't let them in and they have to teach at schools with 3 directions in the name because they're being discriminated against. And I, think, conservatives have done that for a pretty long time.
Yeah.
But the theory of why they're mostly underrepresented in university faculties always seemed a little lame. And in particular, it drew upon what I would call a sort of discrimination analogy that conservatives are mostly skeptical of in other domains. Mm-hmm. And so I thought it was a little peculiar that they were themselves drawing on that approach to explain their own discrimination. So that was thing one that was going on in this paper. As I said, actually, I think this absence is a really complicated social phenomenon. And it's produced by a lot, and by not complicated, actually complex, in the sense that Santa Fe Institute people think about a complex social process, which is it's part of the interaction of a bunch of separate kinds of processes all working together. And so I said, well, that doesn't make it better. It makes it worse, because if it was just discrimination, right, then we actually have a lot of administrative technologies for dealing with problems that are just a result of discrimination, right? We have a lot of things you could just apply, and you could say, well, we've got all these other HR processes. We'll just do all the same for ideology, and then it'll all sort itself out. So that made me think about what we might call sort of structural theories of group disparities. And again, part of this, I should also think that when I was writing this, I thought, wow, wouldn't it be really clever to use structural theories of group disparities, which we usually think of, right? I mean, that's what critical race theory
Right,
is,
right,
right? Is
right,
a
right.
structural theory of group
Structural
disparity.
racism as opposed to individuals who hate
Yeah.
black people. Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously part of me, being the kind of academic I was attracted to the irony of that. And particularly I would say, I joke, I was attracted to the idea that maybe I'd be the first person making an argument for critical race theory in national affairs. So that's what kind of got me off the bench, just to give you a little bit of background. So the answer to your question, which is the original thing, was Greg Conti, who is at Princeton and is actually conservative, and now, as I understand, has tenure. So he's a little bit of a object, some kind of an object lesson of some sort here. Wrote a piece on academic sectarianism in Compact magazine, and that was the basic argument. The argument was that universities have become sectarian in the way that previous universities were religiously sectarian, right? They were organized around a basic set of consensual moral norms, understandings of what the good is, and that, right, and that they
Right,
had increasingly not been organized themselves as pluralistic institutions, but
right,
as
right,
narrow and sectarian. And he was sort of drawing out the consequences of what it would mean for universities to be sectarian. And one of the implications of that is that a sectarian university is also one that might find it hard to legitimate itself with the various different kinds of constituencies that universities depend on.
right.
And so, right, so that was where, and this, because part of this is, I didn't really want this to be a piece about conservatives in academia, because I
Hmm.
think the subject is bigger than that.
Right, right,
And just in terms of self-defense, I
right,
increasingly thought of myself as being part of the population that was increasingly outside the
right,
boundaries of where the
right.
sectarian thing of universities
Yeah,
was.
this is why I started with that question, because I think we need to distinguish, and you do distinguish, between the university as a sectarian institution and the as, and we can talk about what the sect is, but and the university as a cultural institution whose members tend tend toward the left of center. Um, One is new, I mean, the old sectarianism is not new, but the new sectarianism is new. The the universities as kind of liberal in the Democratic Party sense, as opposed to the other sense, which they also are or have been historically. That's not new. I mean, that's something you would have found in the 70s, or probably even to some degree in the 50s.
Yeah. So the way I would think, if I was, one of the sins of my academic sect is periodization. So I'm going to do a little bit of a periodization scheme, right?
Yeah.
So universities very much used to be sectarian.
Right.
They were
Right.
sectarian in the sense of being, especially elite private ones
Right. Right.
were sectarian in the sense of being WASPs, right? I mean, Yale, Harvard, all of these were all WASPy institutions and thought of themselves as both, sectarian in a religious sense, but sectarian in a class and even caste sense.
Right.
And the thing that happens to a lot of those institutions, especially after World War II, is they start rethinking the degree to which they want to just be institutions
Right.
that are like finishing schools for people who went to Chode and
Right. Right. Yeah.
and that's also a result of competition from these sort of rising new public institutions. And
Right.
my colleague Ed Niskanen, Jeff Cabaservice, has a great book called The Guardians, which is about Kingman Brewster when he was president of Yale. And Brewster was really under the sense that these institutions that he cared about a lot were being left behind by Berkeley and Wisconsin and places like that, that were just these huge, they were meritocratic. They were organized around research and around science. And his worry
Right.
was that, that Yale was going to be an institution for like a dying establishment that was all, kind of reverting to the mean, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so that's why, his project was a meritocratic project, but also
Right.
a desectarianizing project.
Right, right. So,
And so,
so when you, yes, I hadn't thought of, I had been thinking when I was thinking of sectarian institutions, I was thinking of ones religiously sectarian.
and they were,
Um,
right? I mean,
you know,
the old,
yeah.
Ivy League
Yeah,
ones.
actually, I don't know about the other ones, but Princeton had mandatory chapel.
Yeah,
I don't know, for a long time. I have a Jewish classmate whose father was one of, I don't know, three Jews in the class of 57 or something. And, he used to go, I forget whether it was the first service or the last one. Maybe it depended on how late he stayed up on Saturday night. But, and there were no Jewish services, is the point.
but I mean, I think the most important thing is, right, they were not viewed as supposed to incorporate the full pluralism of the society,
Right,
right? They were the
right,
possession of a particular cultural group, and they
right,
didn't pretend that they were supposed to
right,
be pluralistic in that sense. So part of what happens as universities become meritocratic, right, and they, especially elite universities, they start emphasizing science. They become more meritocratic in their hiring and their admissions. So Harvard and Yale start trying to get farm boys from Iowa to come who pass
right,
IQ tests, right, and stuff like that.
right,
They also, in the process, become more consciously pluralistic. They're less
right,
defined by the cultural project of a particular group, right?
right.
And so when people think about, that kind of university, one thing to remember is it didn't last very long, right?
No,
That university that some people are like, oh, remember back when, right?
yeah.
Back when didn't go very far.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's very true. Greg Lukianoff, the president of Fire, once said in my presence, there was no golden age of the university. We're always funny. I said, actually, Greg, there was, and I was an undergraduate then. I mean, the golden age of the university lasts from like, I don't know, it depends on the school, but like from 1969 to 1985 maybe, or 89. I mean, it's like a 20-year period basically.
Of course, the other thing to remember is, most people believe they were in college in whatever the golden age
Yeah,
was.
no, I was specifically talking about the issues of free speech and
Yeah,
and freedom
yeah,
of inquiry, and let the students run their own lives. And I used to call it was after the 60s and before PC, you
right.
know.
So I think period wise that makes sense. And so this sectarian university, right? But again, is not complete because all of these and nothing ever works like there's all one period and then everything switches. These are
Right,
all
right,
things that are like
absolutely. And the
layered
other thing
on.
is we should say is that to some degree, you know, if you're a meritocratic university, that is you don't take everybody either as faculty or as students, you are defining a certain kind of sect within society, people who are good at school.
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, go on.
So I would say, right. So one thing to remember is all of the, in some ways, right, even the oldest version, right, that older waspy version of the university is in some
Right.
ways still there in those tectonic layers of the
Yeah, yeah.
institution. So there's still some remnants of that. You still meet people who are like sixth generation of Eli's or something, right? And then, right, there's this meritocratic university that's layered on top of it, right? Lots of people still, especially in the sciences, right, they still entirely live in that university,
Right,
right?
right,
And then there's the university that really starts to develop as the cadre that goes into the university, into the professorships in the 1970s and 80s, then sort of takes over, and that's a lot of where we incorporate the movements that begin in the 60s and then movements of sexual liberation and lots of the other stuff, right? And that increasingly becomes the sort of dominant ethos of social science and humanities and much of the administrative cadre of the university. right? So
Right.
when as I think of it, right, it's those layers, but the part that's most consequential for how we think about society, right, is also the one that is the most sort of in that new sectarian side, right,
Right.
where
Right.
the professional project of all these different disciplines as well as professional schools is increasingly mixed up with the political, with the professional project and the political project are sort of melded together. And this is something you see not just in universities, but you see in public health and medicine and lots of other domains. And that's like one of the basic phenomenon of polarization. I was just writing an essay about this today. A lot of what we're polarized around is expertise and professionalization. And that makes
Right.
the university part of the center of the thing we're arguing about in polarization.
Right. Right. So you use the term liberal institutionalist to describe yourself, and I certainly know many professors who would use that to describe, or who, if they knew it, would use it to describe themselves. They tend to be baby boom age, um, but which is one of the issues. But what do you mean by that?
So I actually think this is a term that my editor Yuval Levin put
Oh,
in.
okay.
I'm not even entirely sure I did it, but I'll own it
Right.
because I wrote the article, and everybody seems to like calling me that. I
Right.
mean, part of it is again, I think this has different meanings in different parts of the university, right?
Right.
So by institutionalist, I think part of that is this idea of pluralism, right? That the university should be an institution that exists to serve the entire society. And that for the purposes of the pursuit of knowledge, that disagreement is good,
Mhm.
right? That and that we need certain kind of institutions in order to preserve that pluralism and disagreement, because the natural tendency of all institutions is toward homophily, right? Homophily is the natural state, and that's one
Okay.
thing again I always emphasize is it's that's an artificial, what you might call institutionally generated equilibrium, because in general any institution is going to gradually squeeze out disagreement because disagreement is annoying and it creates more work.
One might
And
even call it disagreeable. Yeah.
yeah, right. So, right, and so one is the idea that we actually need to consciously, constantly produce this through institutions that prevent us making our political or normative views entirely wrapped up with our professional duties, right? So that's part of it. Is also the idea, not to go like Weberian on you, right? But about some of this is about role specific behavior, right? That part of what it means to be an institution is the idea that you're not just supposed to be enacting your own norms, but you're
Right.
supposed to be acting on a role which to some degree constrain, and that role is the role of professor, right?
Right.
Which
Right.
has but both has legitimation for you speaking in certain ways, but also constrains your behavior in certain ways.
Right, right, right. And that includes things that are not part of this discussion, like, you know, you don't just give everybody an A so they'll love you. You have responsibility, although that happens, there's a lot of pressure on that, especially in the
Yeah.
consumerist university, but that's a different subject.
Yeah, although I do think the consumerist university is not unrelated
Oh yeah,
to
I have
this.
I have a post which I should link to in the school in the show notes that in was also originally a talk, which talks about how these two things are related.
And
Yeah,
I do think that market logic and institutional logic are a hard fit
yeah,
in some
yeah.
ways, right?
Right,
But I think they're especially a hard fit as institutions have increasingly come to resemble one another, right? So that homophily or isomorphism
right.
is increasingly right. When you went to Princeton, not that long ago, I should say, not that long
A
ago,
very long
but
time ago.
I mean, Princeton really had more of a distinctive ethos
Yeah,
than it does today.
yeah.
Um, and Dartmouth, right? People had a real sense of what it meant to go to Dartmouth,
Right,
as
right, right,
distinct from
right.
Princeton or, God forbid, Brown, right?
Yeah,
And a lot of the the market logic have led these institutions to come to resemble one another,
Right.
which in a way constrains their ability to actually, discipline people in like what it means to be this kind
Right.
of person,
Right.
or to grade
Right.
them down
Right.
or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah.
Because again, as you were saying, they're consumers rather than subjects of a kind of institution that they've decided they want to be
Right.
socialized in.
Right. 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 So the puzzle in all of this, not just in your article, but in the general phenomenon, is you talk about, and it is completely correct, that incumbents tend to reproduce themselves. Um, if absent some sort of imperative, if people are hiring in a company, they'll tend to hire people like themselves, people who went to their same schools, people who they feel comfortable with, et cetera. This is the tendency toward homophily. Um, and uh, so there's incumbents reproducing themselves. There's a general pressure on homophily. How did this happen? Because we went from a world in which the professoriate was liberal, uh, you know, slightly left of center, but also liberal in the more general sense of valuing liberal inquiry, et cetera, to a, a world in which the professoriate is hard leftist in many disciplines, certainly in the humanities and in many of the social sciences. How did that happen? Do you have a theory?
Well, so the longer I've thought about this, so when I mentioned in the article that I was when I went to UVA between 1989 and 1994, I had three quite conservative professors: Jim Caesar, Martha Durthick, who was my dissertation head, and Stephen Rhodes.
I
And
just, as an aside, I will say Jim Caesar reviewed the Future and His Enemies in the Weekly Standard.
there you go. Did you like it?
Yeah, I have to go back and see if I can find it. He did, and it was one of the very few, perhaps the only intellectually engaged reviews that book
Yeah.
got.
And Jim was an incredible professor. Now, so part of my theory of this was, universities expand dramatically, right? I mean, it's really hard for people to remember how few people went to university
Right,
not that long ago.
right.
The
Yeah,
one, right, in the aftermath of World War II, there's a big cadre of people who, before World War II, might not have gone to university,
right,
and
right.
certainly would not have gone to elite universities. So I was actually thinking about this because at least two of my dissertation advisors were Straussians,
Mhm.
and there were all these people who went and studied with Leo Strauss in the 1950s and 1960s. A lot of whom were Jewish, right? They would not have been
Right,
able to go to many
right,
of these elite institutions before. But there was a big kind of almost random sort, right? Where
right,
all
right,
these people were just in academia suddenly,
right,
right? And
right.
so some of
Yeah,
those were people who were more conservative. And I think in some ways academia was less
right,
self-sorting for a very
right, right,
period. And
right,
then those people went and created a bunch of students. So like Harvey Mansfield was the son of a Harvey Mansfield Sr., who was a professor, right? But a
yeah,
lot of these other Straussians were not. But then they went and trained students at Cornell and Harvard, right?
right,
So Steve
right,
Rhodes went to Cornell and studied with Alan Bloom and Walter
right,
Burns and a
right,
lot of
right,
those kind of people, right? But we haven't had another big explosive resorting.
right, right,
So that's where I think now, then this sort of, and part of it is also, at least in my field, was the decline of the Straussian project. So that was like
hmm
a big academic project that like drew a lot of people who were, not all of them. Bill Galston is not a conservative. I'm not a conservative.
right.
But a lot of them were, and it drove them in. For a while, Rational Choice sort of did
Yeah, I was
that.
that. What? Yeah, I knew rational choice people in the I guess
Yeah,
mid to
yeah,
late '80s, and that's very sort of mathy and economic sea
Yeah.
and
So right. So I would say so one part of this phenomenon is I think, there haven't been new movements and ideas on the right that have been as generative as those were. And again, rational choice was complicated, right? There were
right,
some people
no,
who went in more public choicey directions and were more libertarian,
right,
and other people who weren't. But it definitely pulled a lot of those people in, right? I think that there has been more general social society wide education
right,
sorting, but I do think the biggest part of this is there was a really big expansion of higher ed in the 60s and 70s, right?
right,
And that's when so the same time as you get a really big increase in the professoriate, you also get the people who are going in and getting all those jobs are people who are in graduate school in the late 60s and early 70s.
right,
So that's part of the really big shock that sort of has this one time movement to the left, and then on after in the aftermath of that, then there's a general recognition in academia that even as they became more ideologically diverse in that period, that they were still very racially and gender not very diverse. And so there's lots of effort to incorporate racial and gender
right,
minorities, but in the process, right, they mostly incorporated a segment of
right,
those racial and gender
right,
minorities who were generally on more on the
right,
left, and so that creates
right. Well,
um,
they did it by creating studies programs, either as new departments or I'm not
yeah,
exclusively, obviously,
yeah,
but lots of studies programs, either as new departments or within existing departments, and then hiring into those. And those programs, for the most part, are by definition hard leftist
well,
projects. I mean,
yeah.
feminism is a little different because it has many strands, but even
Yeah, so
there,
I think some of that's in departments, some of it's in the creation of new departments. And again, I don't think in a way that was inevitable. That was a
no.
historical
I
contingent
mean,
phenomenon.
it's as though post World War II, the way you incorporated Jews into the professoriate was by having lots of, Jewish studies and Holocaust studies, but everybody's too traumatized to have that yet. So
Yeah. So anyway, so I think
those
that's
did
one.
come eventually, but they didn't come.
And one thing
So,
that does is that increasingly puts those kinds of subject matters as more central to all of
right,
these disciplines. And the other thing is that, yeah, and most of the universities thought that their fundamental legitimacy was connected to their ability to incorporate racial minorities and women. Right? That
right,
was a really fundamentally,
right,
genuinely believed, totally
right,
not
right,
cynical
right,
thing
right. And
in a way that they didn't think.
it's not completely crazy.
No, it's not
Um,
completely crazy at all, right? Again, I have questions about exactly
yeah,
how it was
exactly.
done, and I think that the way it was done made the tension between racial and gender diversity and ideological diversity sharper than it would have been if that had been constructed in a different way.
Right,
And I think
right,
that's still relevant today. But so one thing they did is it put all those subjects as much more central to all of these different disciplines. At the same time as there was not, again, in retrospect, this may have been a mistake, but people didn't think that there was a similar legitimacy imperative to making sure that like conservatives were on faculties and the subjects, the
right.
conservatives and libertarians. And I always had conservatives and libertarians because I'm talking to you. So I have to make sure I cover my ass. So I think that there just wasn't that legitimate. Like people didn't look around their faculty and were like, "Oh my God, people will not view us as legitimate because there's no dynamists," right?
Yeah,
Like that wasn't the
or
thing,
there's no military history is a better
right? Or
example, or
religious study, whatever it was,
yeah,
right?
right,
So part of this ends up, right, I think, is that the subject matter that increasingly became central to these, even if people were not trying to hire ideologically within those subject
right,
matter, the subject matter became increasingly encoded with the kind of things that people who are left of center tend to think are more important, and subject matter that were not. So the one example I always use is Charles Moscos, who was a very well known
yeah,
sociologist, military sociologist at Northwestern University. I just was talking to one of his former colleagues who said his class was the most popular class he knew of at Northwestern. Like people just took,
Yeah.
and he studied the military. He
Right.
wrote a very famous book on the incorporation of racial minorities into the army. And so, people who were like Charles, I don't think was, quite a conservative, but he was sort of that way. He was a little, I would say authoritative, not authoritarian. Were drawn in because that was a subject
Right.
matter that was consistent with what they thought was important, and
Right.
they wanted to, imbue themselves with those institutions and understand them.
Right.
And I think that's one really important mechanism by which academia has gradually squeezed out people on the conservative or
Yeah. The other
libertarian side.
thing I wonder about, because, it took me till I was 60-ish to figure out what I would study in graduate school if I went to graduate school. But back when I was in school, which was in the late 70s and early 80s as an undergraduate, the conservative critique was a conservative critique was, for example, that the history from below movement, social history, was terrible. It took away from studying the things that a historian should study. And now I realize that, and it actually didn't take me very many years out of college to realize it. Actually, that's really valuable history, and I'm really interested in how people lived and in material culture and in what was happening in academia at that period, which I knew nothing about until decades later. The history of consumption, which is not, I mean, the people who study that, what I would say is they're not Marxists. They're not conservative. They're not libertarian. They're just not Marxists. And the entire field was characterized by people like Gertrude Himmelfarb and others as if it were completely useless and just a bunch of Marxists. I'm not doing,
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways she did that kind of history, but so I wonder, and that's history, now, does that have long-term consequences? I have no idea.
Yeah, it certainly is the case that history as a field took a very hard turn toward social history and away from studying generals and presidents
Right.
and whatnot. And this, in a way, gets to a little bit. The mention of Himmelfarb gets to one of the mechanisms in the paper, which is the degree to which people on the right are, to some degree, implicated in their own oppression. That if so there is a lot of the phenomenon that we're talking about. There's some actual discrimination, or at
Right.
least taste for discrimination. There's a lot of people structuring their fields such that they're attracted to the kind of things they're normatively committed to, right? But there's also a lot of people on the right, in a way, over egging the custard and saying that like everything in universities is horrible, that they're all just systems of oppression, right? And if you say that over and over again, it
Right.
shouldn't shock you that none of the people who are listening think that they should go to graduate school, right?
Right.
Because all their
Especially when it's combined with the very good, completely apolitical advice I was given as a senior in college. Don't go to graduate school. There are no jobs.
right. So right. So I do think I tend to underplay the things that are really specific to conservatives, which is, if you are more oriented toward having a family, toward having a family younger, right, then the risk that that you won't get a job, that you're going to have to be in school for a very long time, that's going to delay fertility, right? Probably does matter. I think that story is a little more plausible to me than the story that conservatives are stupid, which like they're like,
Have you
you know,
met any? I mean,
I've met
there are no, no, no. I'm saying people who say that they haven't met the right conservatives because
right,
obviously there are stupid conservatives, but there's stupid liberals too,
but I'm
stupid
saying
leftists.
there's a whole literature of people
Yeah,
who basically are applying,
yeah,
in the article I say this is an irony in that when people on the right try and explain group differences by underlying, you know, fundamental differences in group averages, they're
right,
accused of being eugenicists, and
right,
they're right. That is a bad way to try and explain social phenomenon.
right,
I also think, even not just predictably, but in a democracy, we should generally try and avoid explaining group differences by underlying inherent
right,
differences.
right.
So that, but I find the other thing about, you know, that conservatives, almost by definition, that being conservatives often tend to emphasize family, all that kind of stuff, right? You know, that's different than the story that conservatives are greedy or that they're not intellectual, right?
Right,
In
right.
some cases,
Yes,
it's not that
that's
they're
true.
greedy; it's actually they're highly pro-social, but they're
Right,
familiar. So anyway, but I do think the story that conservatives, in some sense, have played a role in this, right, by so stigmatizing universities and
right,
taking, you know, what is, you know, our institutions that deserve a certain criticism,
right,
and then kind of demonizing them. That tends to produce people simply not playing, and this is where I say the discrimination explanation does a lot less work than the explanations that try and explain who's in the pool in the first place. And a
hmm,
lot of that is self-selection. Now, some of that self-selection is based on perception of discrimination. And
right,
that's one
right.
thing we know is, you know, the perception of discrimination does all the work of actual discrimination.
Right, 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 right. So why don't you walk through your sort of analysis? We've kind of hit it in a
Yeah.
disorderly way. So what are the other explanations that you
Yeah,
go
I mean, I think
through
we've
and
gone through some. So there's the ones that I sort of talk about and try and say they just
right,
can't explain enough, right? I don't think discrimination. One, I don't think underlying attributes are the best explanation. We talked about that. I
right,
don't think discrimination is the best explanation. Now, there is evidence that there's a substantial number of people who have a taste for discrimination,
right,
but it's a sign of how bad things are that they just don't have enough of an opportunity to actually do it because they're just not given enough chance to actually have conservatives applying. So I actually think the way that disciplines have gotten constituted is a very important explanation.
hmm,
That if the kind of things that people who are conservatives or libertarians care about are not the things that departments are searching for or that
hmm,
they're attracting graduate students in, then obviously that's gonna lead people not to come. I do think the story that young conservatives listen to old conservatives and don't, you know, and decide that the discipline is just not for them. It doesn't want them,
right,
which I think is true enough, but
right,
is not really true. And then
right,
the last one, which is where I draw on Neil Gross's really excellent book, why professors are liberal and why conservatives care,
right,
is that he argues there that academia, for a variety of reasons, and it's not really so much the faculty, right, as it
hmm,
is the cultural ethos of universities, right? When you're becoming a professor, you're also choosing to make a life in a certain kind of
right,
cultural milieu, right? And that's less about ideas than what I think of as ideology as culture. So this is me
hmm,
sucking up to you.
yeah,
I think I'm going into your domain here. But you know, again, universities are and university towns, right? You think about if you're choosing to go to academia, you're choosing to live and raise your kids and spend all your day. And liberals, that culture, that left, what I'll call left culture, is a subsidy for people on the left, right?
right,
They get to be in an environment in which they're constantly reinforced in the kind of things that make them feel at home,
right,
right? They feel, you know, and again, these are many people who, when they were growing up, did not feel at home. right? They
right,
were growing up in some small town in Indiana and hated everybody else and
right,
hated school spirit. And then they were like, oh God, I got to go to the university where I get to be me and have blue hair and be, sexually non-conforming and do yoga and whatever, right? And so all those things are a subsidy, right? People will forego income
yeah,
in order to have a larger milieu that's consistent
right,
with the way.
right, right.
For conservatives, all of those same things operate as a tax, right?
Yeah,
You have to pay them more to put up with all that stuff, right? And it's not
yeah,
that they don't want to be scholars and sit in the library and write. It's that when they have to go buy all the posters that are on the wall and the t-shirts that people are wearing and all of that, which again is less about the academic side and more
yeah,
about the cultural side. I think that actually plays a very important role. And that's in a way, it's another part of the university, right? It's
right,
those
right,
more the people in like student life
right,
and all of the other parts that are not the academic
right,
disciplines that play more role. And even if you change what was going on in the academic disciplines, it would still be that the kind of ideologically coded culture of the universities would selectively draw
right,
people in.
right, right. Yeah, in preparing for this interview, I decided to go on the look at job advertisements for faculty. And what I was specifically interested in were the jobs inherently, political, which actually, compared to other times that I've looked at, it wasn't as much. But if you actually looked in the job descriptions, and this was uniformly the case for UCLA, you know, no matter how minor the job, no matter what it was about, they required a DEI statement as part of the application. Well, okay, so there's an issue about, this is an ideological construct, even though they say, I mean, anybody could talk non-ideologically about dealing with diverse student populations or, incorporating things into curriculum and stuff. But you got to say certain things or they're not going to pick you. So that's like a screen. So anybody like me, for example, thinking, I mean, they even require this for teach in the UCLA extension for Pitten's course on, on nonfiction writing. Just like life is too short.
Yeah. I mean, so it's funny. I've thought a lot about this DEI statement stuff. Because on the one hand, especially public institutions,
Right.
a big part of the job is dealing with a big
No,
diverse, diverse in all kind of ways, right? So
right, right, right.
for
Yeah,
and so if I was saying, what should be the qualifications, or at least one of the qualifications. Again, one thing in universities is people play a lot of different roles,
right,
and some
right,
people
right,
play
right,
the role, disproportionately play the role of mentor and whatever,
right,
and some
right,
people
right.
are just totally socially incompetent and sit in the library and God love them. You don't want
Yeah,
them to do anything but being in a lab, not talking to anybody.
yeah.
But it's not unreasonable
No,
to
it's
say,
not. That's why I've sort of prefaced it with saying, I mean, I've only taught at a university for 2 years when I had a fellowship at the Smith Institute at Chapman University. And it was certainly the case. And even though Chapman is basically, I shouldn't say, but the student body is not especially diverse, although they're making efforts and
yeah,
they have, since I left, they've created a program that basically subsidizes, that finds the smart local Latino kids
yeah.
and
Well,
encourages
so,
them.
yeah,
But what I was going to say is we did think about those things, and I did think about like how do I um, teach students for whom English isn't a first language, which in that case was primarily foreign students. But how do I incorporate different experiences into the literature we read, not just for the people who might identify with it, but also as a world broadening thing. All of these things are part of good teaching. Um, but when you have to write a statement, you think of it as, oh, this is what they're going to use to screen out people like me.
Yeah. And I think in practice, there's a good reason to think it functions like that, right? The
Yeah,
only thing I'm trying to say is I actually think, and I thought about this a lot more since I wrote the piece about the kind of tragedy of the way that the very serious need for universities to serve the entire population.
right,
And this it's an affirmative action, which is a more complicated question, but I do think that's a basic function
right,
of
right,
higher ed institutions, and the ideological sort of project are often framed as being rivals of one another.
right,
I've
right,
heard people say this. I've heard people say, "Oh, this whole thing about like the ideological diversity is just because white guys are on the back foot now."
right,
Maybe. I mean, but I think in some ways that's a unfortunate consequence of, and part of the way that we go out and recruit, especially at the graduate level, racial and other minorities, right? That there's a lot, there's a lot of African Americans are the most religious population in the country. That's not
right,
true of the segment who we mostly recruit into social
right,
science and humanities, right? If we recruited in a somewhat different way, the ideological and the racial thing. Now, again,
right,
the ideological distribution among African Americans is not the same as it is among white Americans, right?
right, right,
They're in part because they're all in the Democratic Party, pretty much.
right.
Less so
But I
than
doubt that, I mean, I don't know, but I would guess that the proportion of Marxists and similar hard left things among African Americans is not that different from the general population.
no, no. So again,
Yeah,
I think obviously there's lots of self-selection within the racial and gender diversity that
right,
universities
right,
have tried to attract, which has exacerbated this
right,
phenomenon,
right,
right?
right,
In some
right,
ways, if you did a more random draw of African Americans and Hispanics, you would get a more ideologically diverse professoriate. And
right,
so
right,
that for me is actually one of the ways that we should be addressing the problem we've been discussing,
right,
is actually doing more creative outreach within those populations,
right,
within our outreach, which we all of us do. In political science, we have a thing called the Ralph Bunche Institute, which tries to attract, especially African Americans, but other racial minorities into political science. Right? If we were more consciously trying to strive for ideological diversity within those racial and gender
right, right,
categories, the tension would be less severe than it is now.
right, right. I have read, I forget, an essay by a young Black conservative who talked about going to a historically Black university. I forget which one. I think it was just one of the state ones. And talking about how one of the things that's nice there is that there's not this immediate assumption because you're Black, you must have X politics. I mean, obviously, you're going to be particularly likely to vote Democratic, but there's all kinds of Democrats also. But um, anyway, I wish I could remember who wrote that. But actually, the term affirmative action occurred to me while I was reading this because part of what you're arguing for is that universities pursue affirmative action, not quotas, but affirmative actions to try to diversify their faculty ideologically. And you go through a number of things that, if you were a university and you decided that this was a problem and you wanted to find, attract good candidates for your graduate schools or for your faculty who were represented a broader range of political views, here are the things you should do. So why don't you
Yeah. So
run through some of
I
those?
mean, part of it is I do think there's a good argument that just if all of the presidents of the Ivy League, right, got together on a stage and said, we really want conservatives applying for our graduate programs, right? We
Right.
think they would be good. We think there's a problem, so we're not going to gaslight you anymore and tell you that there either isn't a problem, or it's a problem that we're just going to say we don't have all the answers about what to do about it, and I personally don't have all the answers about doing right. And again, I'm enough of a conservative to believe there's lots of problems for which the solutions are worse than the problem, right?
Right.
But we think it's bad. We
Right.
think it's bad that our disciplines are not as diverse in the kind of things they study, the kind of people they attract, and we think it's bad that lots of people who would be great academics decide either they believe that there'll be discrimination or they will believe that universities don't want really high quality scholarship from the kind of things that they do. And so they
Right.
should just say that. They should just say that we want you, right? And within the scope of our control, which presidents is thankfully not as that bad, right?
Right.
But enough, we're going to try and send a signal that it's really important that you departments, right?
Right.
That if you get applications from conservatives, and we're going to try and encourage people to apply, that you're going to treat them just like you do anybody else, right? When they come to study with you, you're going to treat them, in an institutionalist way, right? Again, lots of faculty want that, right? They
Right.
don't, I've talked to lots of people who are like, I would love to have conservatives in my seminars and advising them for PhDs.
Right.
But
Right.
right now, there aren't the same institutional devices. In fact, again, people on the right have spent more
Right.
time, in a
Right.
way, indirectly steering people away from
Right.
academia.
Right. Of course, these people, they are not in English departments. And I say that, oops, sorry, from the experience of my colleagues, specifically Catherine Gillespie Moses and Michael Moses, who, came to Chapman with visas better than anybody, or I don't know anybody, but certainly the vast majority of the English department. And she actually does, and they don't do conservative work. They're both sort of classical liberal types, but she does feminist literary scholarship, and he does uh, scholarship on movies. And this is a school with a big film school. And they could not, the Smith Institute had money to hire them and wanted to hire them, and the English department would not hire them, would not let them join its faculty, and they are officially in the business school, um, and it was purely ideological. It was not. It was
Yeah.
basically, we're a bunch of leftists. We don't trust you. We're going to gin up something about funding, but it's not. If the Hewlett Foundation gave money for an anti-neoliberal center at Chapman or any place else, nobody screams and yells and says, you can't do that. It's anyway.
Well,
So
like I
this is
say,
what makes
I'm listening
people.
to-
This is what makes people. I'm worried. Quite frankly, I am worried. I love universities. I believe in universities. I believe in political pluralism within universities. I am not a liberal. I'm not a conservative. I am. I will probably vote for Harris. I definitely won't vote for Trump. But I'm worried about the survival outside of a very few subjects of people who are, normal liberal Democrats who are scholars in today's universities.
Yeah, again, so again, the thing I suggest is, in a way, both universities and people on the right need to take a step toward each other, right?
Yeah.
Because again, there are a lot of people of conservatives, who love universities,
Right.
right? They
Right.
love the idea of universities. They love the idea of higher education. And it's for them, it's a kind of unrequited love, right? They want the
Yeah.
university to
Right.
love them back, right?
Right.
I think some of this is also, many of the people on the right, and one person this is going to come into a book that she's writing, so I'm not going to say the name or whatever, but she describes this as, the old gods and the new gods, right? And that conservatives still, right, are attached to many of the old gods of academia, old gods of scholarship, right? And that one possible solution to some of our problems is creating institutions that are more capable of, in a way, accepting polytheism, right? Accepting the idea that the university will have space for both the old and the new
Right,
gods. And I found
right.
that a really profound. So look for a book that somebody else is writing. Don't give me credit for this idea being good.
Right.
But I think that's, so some of these new, schools that are being created in red states. When I
Yeah.
wrote this piece, I was more skeptical of them,
Right.
but I understand them more if you understand them way as institutionalizing the maintenance of the study of the old gods, right, in these things, right? And that
Right.
tension, again, I'm an Oakeshottian, and Oakeshott, famously this book that really had a big influence on me called The Politics of Faith and Politics of Skepticism, says that, what you really want is dynamic tension. You want dynamic tension
Right.
between principles, right? And for me, that's the ideal university. The ideal university has that dynamic tension between the old and the new gods. And so I actually think that's promising. And the last thing that'll do is, again, we talked all the way in the beginning. We rolled your thing all the way
Right.
back.
Right.
You'll
Right.
remember we talked about like conservatives just complaining,
Right.
right?
Right.
And the last thing America needs is just to have conservatives complaining more, right?
Yeah.
The
Right.
best thing in this way, this is the thing that gets into the abundance stuff that you
Right.
see
Right.
the transition
Right.
I did there. That was really good, right?
Right. Right. Good. Good
Part of
job.
abundance is that people should not just have to sit around and complain. If
Yeah.
they want,
Right.
if they don't like it, they should be able to go
Right.
and do something different, and then we
Right.
can all judge it. So I'm kind of skeptical of University of
Right.
Austin, right?
Right. Right.
God love them, right? Go
Yeah.
do that
Right.
thing.
Right.
And if it
Yeah.
turns out to be great, then we can all judge you by the thing you created.
Right. 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 I have a weird skepticism of university startups as opposed to like something like you mentioned the Hamilton Center or whatever it's called at University of Florida, which is that it takes decades, even centuries, to build a good library. And not everything is online, believe it or not. But that's me. I mean, that's the kind of research I want.
Right.
Um,
Although
I will say,
Florida, right? They got
yeah.
the
Well,
library.
no, I said that's different from the
Yeah.
than the University of Austin, because
Yeah.
if you start something within it, I mean, the James Madison Center at Princeton, it's got the best library ever.
Right.
It's like, but sorry,
Your
Harvard.
experience of Firestone was different than mine.
Yeah, I guess so. But but I was thinking that one thing, and Institute for Humane Studies is an example of this. I mean, one of the best things that could be done if you're concerned about ideological diversity is to subsidize the graduate school of people who are ideologically diverse and get them to go to graduate school as an option. Like the option, I realize, the option value of a PhD is a thing. I mean, it exists. There are jobs you can't be hired with, aside from the fact that you actually learn skills and learn, disciplinary techniques and learn knowledge. Just having the credential is a valuable thing, and I think if people, from the center left rightward were to, and orthogonally, sort of libertarian abundance, whatever, were to work at encouraging promising students and researchers to pursue advanced degrees. It takes a long time, but over time it changes the pool of people. It also means you have to tell people that they may not be academics, but like, Nick Gillespie, who was my successor at Reason, he has a PhD in English, and he's not using it, but he knows stuff from having it.
Well, can I say this one thing as a last point, which is I think I disagree with you. I think you're thinking too much like an economist and not enough like a sociologist on this, right? In part because, IHS has actually been subsidizing graduate education for people for quite a long time. And, we don't know what the but-for world is.
Right,
They haven't been. So, But I actually think if I'm thinking about the margin that's the highest value margin,
Right.
it's the supply side rather than on the demand side. It's not so much on the income as the constraint, right? As I actually think universities do need to take a fairly close look at themselves and say, are we in ways that are even unintentional, right?
Right.
To go back to the sectarian
Right.
point, right?
Right. Right.
Are
Right.
we in a
Right.
way unintentionally sectarian,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
And if we openly at least created more spaces where
Right. Right.
people like this felt
Right.
at home, right?
Yeah.
That would be the more effective lever to sort of
Right.
draw
Right.
in people rather than just trying to reduce
I,
the cost.
I I don't I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying, if you're not a university, what could you do? If you're not a university administrator, I mean, the irony, the funny thing is, Princeton has this James Madison Center, which didn't exist when I was there, but and and it's run by Robbie George, and I disagree with Robbie George on everything, pretty much. Um, but the one time I think I was on a panel at Princeton, it was like organized by him. It was that
I
center.
was a fellow at Robbie George's Center, and I spent the entire year disagreeing with him about gay marriage.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's one of the many things I just, you know, if I'd known about him when I wrote The Future and His Enemies, he could have been one of the enemies. Although he is a firm believer in, freedom of speech and academic freedom, and he and Cornell West, who have this, this duo act that they go on, at least when they were both at Princeton, and are still friends, supporting those values. But yeah, so universities need to step up and make affirmative actions on behalf of ideological diversity. And how one of the things, okay, so the reality of universities is they need, or at least want, money for any kind of new initiative. If you raise money for something that has a sort of a slant, and especially if that slant is not to social justice, so called, you are going to come under attack. So what would you advise? Say the president's, I mean, the Ivy Leagues maybe not the best example because some of them have so much money they can do whatever they want. But say the presidents of the public Ivies, the top public research universities came to you and said, Steve, we agree with your critique. We think we need to do something on this in the same way that we've needed to address other questions about diversity. We don't want to lose, taxpayer support, et cetera. What do we do, and how do we fund it, and how do we get it past the existing faculty?
Yeah, so so I'm actually about to go to a hiring meeting, so I'll make
Yeah.
this.
Okay. Well, yeah.
But what I'll say is, I really don't want them to be motivated by that. Right?
Okay.
That is, I think there are people now who are thinking, "Oh, we really ought to do something on this," and I describe it as like Chris Rufo repellent.
Yeah. No.
They're
Yeah.
just like, "Oh my
Yeah.
god!" I
Yeah.
was just
Right. 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 No, I don't just. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
you remember back in the '80s, people used to have to put the club on their
Oh yeah.
car,
Right, on their car.
right?
Yeah.
And that was like it wasn't because it was so hard to undo the club. It would cause somebody to go and steal somebody else's car.
Right. Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think some people are like, "Oh, we want whatever is the equivalent of the club." And Chris Rufo will go
Go
break into some,
someplace else. Yeah.
right? And I don't think that's a very wholesome
Right.
motivation. But I think, because ultimately the reason to want more of a variety of different kinds of ideological diversity is it's good for the
Right.
university.
Right.
It's
Right.
good
Well,
for our underlying mission.
That's why it's tricky when you say we were going to create these centers. It's like that's a second best alternative at
I do
best.
think it's the second best, but often we live in a second
Yeah.
best
Right. Right. So.
world, right? But so I guess the first thing I would say is I don't think universities should do this because they think Chris Rufo is on them or their trustees are on them or JD Vance is on them, right?
Right.
The
Right.
reason I wrote this piece, and I think it has been circulated pretty
Right.
widely,
Right.
universities is to get us to do our own,
Right,
for our
right,
own reasons,
right,
right?
right,
For
right,
genuinely academic
right,
reasons.
right.
Because I
Well, I
think
did preface it by saying they say, we read your article, Steve, and we agree with you. What
yeah,
should we
so
do now?
I do think that the best thing to do is to start actually on the graduate level.
Uh-huh.
That's one where the tensions between merit and hiring and not
Right,
worrying, and not hiring for ideology. I
right,
think there's some questions in which that's okay,
right.
because I think especially where things like mentoring and things are concerned, ideology is actually a kind of credential under certain
Uh-huh.
conditions.
Yeah, right,
But you don't face any of those same tensions where graduate admissions are concerned. And so I think the first
right,
thing is, again, as I said before, all universities should make a determined, serious effort to go and broaden their pool ideologically, to be worried about where that pool tends to be
right,
self-reproducing, where
right.
people are just applying, they're not applying because they also know who the people who are in grad school now, and they're
Right,
worried,
right, right, right.
that is the easiest and quickest dimension. Now, again, it's not going to give you Chris Rufo repellent, because it's
No,
not going to produce
right,
faculty who you can wave
right,
around and
right,
show to
right,
people.
right, right.
But over the long term, that's the
Yeah.
most wholesome way to address it.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is my thing about culture in general. Anytime you look for a quick fix, it's not going to, it's not, culture changes slowly. And, if I had a, dollar for every time I've heard libertarians and conservatives complain about culture and talk about it the way Marxists, or not even Marxists, but sort of stupid leftists talk about markets, like there's a big switch and you just turn it. I mean, I could fund my own position. you know
In textile studies,
yeah, right. Yeah, so I certainly agree that if you're serious about solving this problem, and I think it is a problem, what you need to think long term. But there are things, as you said, that can be done in the short term. And this reminded me, to circle back, of some of your abundance faction stuff, because the idea of an abundance faction was, you have to do politics. You can't just write articles, which is repellent to me, but I have gone to the occasional YIMBY meeting, but
there you go.
and even local, feedback on this development things, but the idea that you can't just write articles is not so good for people like me, but as you say, you're going into a hiring meeting, so maybe this is something that people like you can get on board. And you say this, I mean, and I know you have to leave, and I want to wrap up also, but I just wanted to know what sort of response you've gotten from this.
I mean, I've been surprised. I actually met with a university president not that long ago, who turned out to have read the article and said he was talking about it with his administrators. Right now, some of this is the national affairs piece was republished in Chronicle of Higher Ed,
Oh,
which is
right, yeah, which,
like the trade publication and
yeah,
things. The thing I mostly learned about this is that people really read the Chronicle of Higher
yes,
Ed.
they do. They really
I
do.
I never read the Chronicle of
Well,
Higher Ed.
you don't read it because you have to get past the paywall, which is
There you go. So anyway, but I think the reception has been more more welcoming than I thought.
Mhm.
And I do think there's a lot of people in universities, and it is really important, especially for people on the right, to remember how heterogeneous
Right,
universities are. And there's lots of people. Now, again, conservatives, in part because of what's going on in electoral
right,
politics, which you
right,
referred to, is not making this job of people like us any
right,
easier.
right.
But I do
Yeah,
think that when we get past the election, depending on how it goes, it may be easier for people to to be willing to take the kind of risks and discomfort that
right,
are associated with doing something about
right,
this.
right, right.
All
Well,
right.
on that seems like a good note to end on. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining me for this conversation with Steve Teles. Please check out the show notes for information on some of the things we talked about. To read my work and hear more podcasts, subscribe to my newsletter at vpostrel.substack.com. Check out my YouTube channel, youtube.com/@vpostrel, which includes a podcast playlist. You can subscribe to Virginia's podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get podcasts. Thanks for listening. See you next time.